Good morning, my friends, and welcome to another incredible installment from very high above all the puerile and pedantic forms of Wyoming mainstream media. This is Cowboy State Politics. I, of course, am your illustrious host, David Iverson, firmly ensconced behind the silver Cowboy State Politics microphone and broadcasting to you from the depths of the Middle Swamp in Wyoming's capital of Cheyenne. Good morning, my friends, and welcome to the program. Happy Wednesday. The Senate and the Wyoming media have finally stepped in it. And by it, I'm referring to a gigantic steaming pile of bullcrap. It should come as absolutely no surprise whatsoever to anyone that the Wyoming media is not telling you the truth about what happened with Senate File 69 yesterday in the Joint Conference Committee. You can watch what happened in the meeting for yourself. It only lasts about 9 minutes. You'll see members of the Senate walk in and pretty much throw a piece of paper down in front of the members of the House of Representatives. It's pretty clear from the video anyway that the members of the House of Representatives had never seen what was written on the piece of paper, and whatever proposal that would have been was brand new to them. But if you listen to the Wyoming media, you would think that they had been the ones to come up with that deal all on their own. That in some back room, in some dark hallway in the Wyoming Capitol, far away from the rank-and-file members of the Wyoming legislature, and farther still from any scrutiny of the Wyoming media. Not that they would provide any scrutiny, of course, but maybe they just could have been there. And in those dark recesses, a deal had been struck. If this were last session, I would tell you that that whole scenario was entirely possible, and more than that, I would say that it was highly probable. Last year, it was almost standard operating procedure for the Redcoats to come up with deals in a back office and then claim that their respective chambers had agreed to all of it. The only thing that would have been required last year is that, on the floor, they convince all of their members to vote for it, regardless of if it had been discussed on the floor or not. But that's not been how this House of Representatives has been operating. In fact, everything has been clear and out in the open. The larger points of what was written on that piece of paper that was thrown down in the Joint Conference Committee is that the House would agree to no backfill in the property tax relief bill, that they would agree to a 25% reduction in property taxes, and that there would be no sunset date, and that they would just completely delete the entire section about the People's Initiative, the one that I said was fairly creative. If you paid attention to any of the debate concerning Senate File 69, you'd realize that this proposal had never been agreed to by either the Senate or the House, that this whole thing was brand new, that this proposal was not the final position of the House, nor was it the final position of the Senate. The way that conference committees work is the Senate and the House both send their representatives into a room, and they negotiate a position between what was finally decided in the Senate and what was finally decided in the House, somewhere in the middle. But that is not what happened in the Joint Conference Committee for Senate File 69. To the Wyoming Turkey Vulture, I mean the Wyoming Tribune Eagle, and I quote, "With deadlines looming, a Joint Conference Committee of 3 Wyoming senators and 3 representatives failed to reach a deal on a sweeping property tax cut measure early Tuesday morning. The deal on the table was to amend Senate File 69, the homeowner property tax exemption, to include a 25% property tax cut for residential structures up to $1 million in value with no backfill from state savings. The proposal also included no sunset date, although the cuts may have been repealed, depending on the outcome of the 2026 ballot initiative to cut 50% of homeowners' property taxes." Skip a paragraph. Quote, "Senate leaders left the meeting frustrated. Quote, as of today, we both had decided to have a 7 a.m. JCC meeting, and we came to agree on the understanding we had made yesterday," Salazar told reporters after the meeting. "It was a surprise to me that this occurred." End quote. It wasn't, and it shouldn't have been a surprise to Senator Tim Salazar because there was no deal to begin with. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to play for you an interview I did with Representative Tony Locke, Representative Chris Knapp, and Appropriations Chair John Baer. In it, I asked the three of them point blank if they had a deal before Tuesday's meeting, and the answer to that is an unqualified no. Back to the turkey vulture. Quote, I've always said that perfection is the enemy of the good. This was a good deal. We supported it. We came here at 7 to sign our names, and it didn't occur, Salazar said. Senate President Bo Beitman told reporters that the House and Senate had made a deal Monday night prior to calling the Joint Conference Committee. We shook hands. We had a deal, Beitman said. End quote. As you'll hear in the interview that I'm going to play for you in just a little bit, according to the House of Representatives, no deal existed. Representative Chris Knapp, a member of the House Joint Conference Committee, says very clearly that he had never seen such a deal, nor did he know anything about it. But let me give you another reason as to why it couldn't have existed. Because such a deal would violate the joint rules of the Wyoming legislature, and it would violate Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedures. Allow me to read it for you. Joint Rule 2.1, subparagraph B, and I quote, a first joint conference committee is not a free committee. However, in addition to recommending that the houses adopt or delete amendments previously adopted by either house, the first committee may propose additional amendments to Romanet number 1, correct technical errors in a previously adopted amendment, or Romanet number 2, make minor language changes in a previously adopted amendment, provided the modified amendment is substantially the same as the original amendment, or Romanet number 3, propose an alternative which reflects a compromise position on an issue on which the two houses have adopted inconsistent positions, provided that the compromise lies between the positions taken by the two houses. End quote. A 25% reduction in property taxes is in no way the position of either the Senate or the House. So let me give you an example of how this works. Let's say, hypothetically, the House passes a bill to give the governor $100 million to do with what he pleases. All right, that's not really going to happen, but let's just say that it does. The Senate passes a bill to give the governor $50 million to do with what he pleases. So there's a $50 million difference between the House and the Senate. They go to conference committee, and they decide that they'll give the governor $75 million. They split the baby, but it's between those two positions. They could not, on their own, give the governor $200 million because that's not between the two positions. In the case of Senate File 69, both the House and the Senate agreed to a 50% reduction of property taxes. That issue is no longer up for debate, according to the joint rules of the House and the Senate. But the Wyoming turkey vulture didn't even ask the question if the supposed deal that everybody had, which they didn't, could even exist. To Wildpile, in an article entitled Property Tax Talks Falter After Senators Accuse House Members of Backing Out of a Deal. And I quote, the deal senators said they had worked out included a 25% exemption for the first $1 million of a single-family home. It did not include backfill for local governments or a sunset date, and an owner-occupied stipulation would have only kicked in after the first year the law was in effect. Quote, they accepted, which is why we came here today was to finish this, Kangaroo Giroux told reporters. But when Kangaroo brought a motion for that compromise at Tuesday's meeting, Heiner said the House side of the panel would oppose pursuing it at this time. Quote, we would like to go back to our members and present this in our caucus, Heiner said, so we would ask for a couple of days to reconvene. End quote. Why did Representative Heiner say that? Because that was not what the House of Representatives decided. Oh, and it's totally against the rules, but who in the Senate really cares about that? To a completely unrelated article in the Cowpie entitled Non-Citizen Status Will Be on Back, Not Front of Wyoming Licenses and IDs. If you scroll about halfway down the article, you'll find this little gem, and I quote, Representative Mike Yin also pointed out that the only change the JCC could make on Tuesday was to the language of the disclaimer. And this, of course, is talking about differences on IDs between the House version and the Senate version, as that was the only difference between the House and Senate's version of the bill. A JCC exists to iron out the differences between the two chambers' actions on a single piece of legislation. End quote. So even Mike Yin knows what the job of a conference committee is. So even if this so-called deal, which they didn't have, reached the floor of the House, it was definitely going to be objected to by Mike Yin and probably others. But the long and the short of all of this, at least according to the members of the Joint Conference Committee in the House, is that this deal never existed in the first place. And the reason why Scott Heiner said he would need more time to go talk to his caucus is they hadn't discussed the possibility of a 25% reduction instead of a 50%. Ergo, and again, according to the guys in the House, this deal was not a thing. When we get back from a brief and completely outrageous profit timeout, I'm going to play for you an interview I did last night with Representative Tony Locke, Chris Knapp, and John Bear. What they have to say is very, very different than what is being reported in the media. And frankly, is the complete opposite of what Tim Salazar, Troy McEwen, and Kangaroo Mike Giroux are saying. So we'll do that in just a second. Today's edition of Cowboy State Politics is brought to you by U.S. Coin Capital.
Here at U.S. Coin Capital, we hear from Americans across the United States who have a growing concern about the future purchasing power of U.S. paper money. Many Americans are looking for an alternative for long-term capital. For more than 35 years, the people at U.S. Coin Capital have educated American investors on how to properly accumulate United States gold and silver coins. Call us at 1-800-878-2646 or visit us on the web, uscoincapital.com.
Cowboy State Politics is also brought to you by Morton Buildings. If you're in the market for any type of metal structure, whether it's a garage or a barn or maybe something bigger, like a roping arena or a giant warehouse, the two guys you need to talk to are Nick and Jesse at Morton Buildings. Their phone number is 307-674-2532, or you can check them out at their website, mortonbuildings.com.
Concerned about the future of Wyoming, but unsure how to help? Honor Wyoming is giving you the chance to create real, lasting influence. And it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. The Honor Wyoming Bill Tracker is designed to empower Wyoming voters. We're cutting through the noise and equipping you with all the info you need to keep tabs on Wyoming lawmakers, as well as the tools to take action on the issues that matter to you most. Keeping a close eye on key legislation in Cheyenne, we've made it easy to stay informed by providing real-time bill updates and timely take action alerts. Our one-click links make it easy to email key lawmakers at the right time. All you have to do is click and your voice will be heard, ensuring lawmakers are listening to the people they serve year-round. Protecting the Wyoming way isn't a spectator sport, and voting is only half the story. Get involved today and do your part. With the Honor Wyoming Bill Tracker, it's as easy as 1, 2, 3.
Go to billtrack.honorwyoming.org. Make sure that you subscribe and follow the program. You can do that from the website, cowboystatepolitics.com, or anywhere that you get your podcasts. That way, you can be notified each and every time there's a brand new episode of Cowboy State Politics. And now, back to why the Wyoming Senate is probably full of crap. Last night, I sat down with a couple members of the Senate File 69 Joint Conference Committee, Representative Tony Locke and Chris Knapp. Also joining us was House Appropriations Chairman John Bear. They have a very different story from the one that the Senate Joint Conference Committee told and the one that was reported in Wyoming media. Here's our conversation. I'm joined this evening by Representative Tony Locke, Chris Knapp, and John Bear. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Glad to be here.
The reason I wanted to talk to you is I've read about, 3 or 4 articles in Wyoming media today about Senate File 69 and what went down with the conference committee. So I guess where I'd like to start is just kind of go around the table and you guys just kind of shoot from the hip and tell me what happened, because I wasn't in the room.
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is not listen to the lion media.
Well, of course not.
I think we should start with Tony, since he was in the meeting and so was Chris.
Well, and I think the biggest issue was, I think there were still some discussions going on, and there was a desire to have more discussion. And when we went into the room, there was some question of whether, because of some of these open issues, that we still wanted to have further discussion internally. I thought that us even having the meeting had become a question, if you will. And when we showed up down there, it was like, okay, we're going to proceed with the meeting. And at least in my case, I still had some issues I need to resolve. So that was the biggest issue I had. So,
Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, it's not at all what was depicted, I think, with the regular media. I think we went in there and just heard their amendments and decided to take that and take it back to our body and have some time with it before we had any decisions. And of course, they moved to approve them, and so we in turn voted no. So.
I had gotten rumor that they were attempting to go to 25%, and from my understanding, in a first joint conference committee, you have to stay between the positions of the two chambers. Well, both chambers passed a 50% property tax cut for the first 2 years, and that's what they're trying to change from 50% to 25%, and I thought it was outside the rules for them to be able to do that. So I was prepared to object if they brought that back to the House chamber. And so, the fact that they ended up voting no, I think was opportune, since, honestly, it's probably outside of the rules, both of the joint rules for the House and Senate, as well as the Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure.
Okay, before we get there, let's just talk about the two positions between the Senate and the House bill, just so we're really clear. So I guess first, what did the House version of Senate File 69 look like?
I think it might be better to, since I just kind of preface that with, what the rules say as far as where you can negotiate from, let's kind of cover it in two ways. One, those things that we agreed upon, which wouldn't be able to be negotiated in that first meeting, and those things that we disagreed on. And I think the biggest things that we disagreed on was a backfill for 50% of that 50% back to the local governments. And then there was an extension brought by Jamie Lean that would have allowed 25% to continue on from 3 years to perpetuity, or until the laws changed. And then on their side, they included land, and we did not include land in the tax reduction. So I think those are the big differences.
I think that's it. That covers it very well.
And so what we did agree upon was 2 years at 50%. And so that was the one thing that they were attempting to change in this first motion.
Now, one thing I've seen a lot of on social media is a complete misunderstanding of how the process works. That, both chambers pass a version of the bill, and then we go to conference. So, John, you mentioned the rules, and I see right in front of you got a copy of Mason's Manual. So what does Mason's Manual say about this joint conference committee and what you have to do? What can you do? What can't you do?
So there's several different rules about how they are created, what kind of powers each one has, and then when they can meet, how they come together, and eventually, what they can negotiate on. So when you have these conference meetings, each side, the presiding officer will pick 3 people typically, and those 3 people will be an individual committee. So whatever action they take, it has to pass, with the majority of those 3 from that side, and then the other side's 3. So they're equal. They negotiate out an agreement, and a majority of each of those 2 committees has to pass that. If they fail to do so, it can lead to the bill dying. It could lead to both sides appointing a second joint committee, and that second joint committee has different rules. They're called a free committee, so they can actually take the bill in a completely different direction than what either body initially intended. Typically, you don't like that to happen because you've got a certain amount of people that have already approved the positions that you have initially, and that's why the first joint conference committee is designed to work just between the 2 positions. And no matter where you land in that first joint conference committee, it has to be somewhere between the two positions. And if both of us were at 50%, which we were, the only place you can land is 50%.
Okay, well, the free committee that you mentioned, that's what happened with the budget last year, right?
Mm-hmm. And that's how we got a high school added in that wasn't part of the negotiations on either side of either chamber in the second joint conference committee. They added a completely new high school. We're still waiting on a Mercer report for that high school, so that it's not under construction yet because they prematurely appropriated those funds, and that was done for what I would call irregular reasons.
And that was the Rock Springs
Yes.
High School?
Yeah, I would say all of that was irregular. So, Tony, I mean, you were in the room. So talk to me about, was there any discussion of any of the rules, Mason's manual, how these conference committees work? Was there any discussion?
There was no discussion about the rules or anything related to in the committee, and there really was very limited discussion on the amendment that was presented. And I believe the House members, we took an opportunity to go through it in some detail. There were a lot of people in the room, and we wanted to make sure that it was clear both to us, the amendments were clear both to us as well as to everyone in the room. What was fairly clear to me was that a broader discussion was not desired or expected. It was pretty clear. It was like, here it is. And we wanted to have a clearer discussion, and as I mentioned, I think we still had some conversation to have on those details with other House members. So,
Now, Chris, there's a lot being made over this deal. Did you guys have a deal to move to 25%?
No, we didn't. In fact, I think there were a couple committee members, one on each side, that had discussions of what one side wanted and what that was. But when I got to committee, that was the first time it had been presented as an amendment. And I had no discussions with any senator on any terms or any stances before that meeting.
and I have had conversations with other senators, but we've gone all around, just in terms of what are your thoughts, are the types of conversations I've had. I have not had what I consider to be any kind of detailed, here's the plan, here's the amendment. That level of conversation I have not had with a senator. And so I've tried to be very open about different thoughts I have and concerns I have. But again, I think when we walked in there, that was, there were certainly expectations on one side, and on the other side, I think we were still in that position to look at it more deeply.
And I'd like to say too, we've had years now of peeling things back and being very transparent. And I think, these committee meetings, the conference committee meetings are televised as well. And I think it's important that those things happen in an open forum with the public, and that those debates, those differences of opinion get hashed out in front of the public. That's a very important piece to government. And so I would say that the news media took that, those private conversations that people do have every day is much different than deciding on our stances and where we fall on the bills.
Oh, it's pretty clear to me that they took up the deal ball and ran all the way to the end zone with it.
Right.
And one thing that kind of amazed me is the speed at which all of those different articles came out. Now, I'm not suggesting that it was planned ahead of time, but man, all of a sudden it was, pretty much every outlet had their own story on this. John, you've been pretty quiet. Unusually quiet,
Quite
by the way.
uncommon. No, well, I wasn't there, and so I didn't have as much to add to this conversation. I think it needs to be said that the Wyoming Freedom Caucus and this leadership of the 68th House of Representatives really came into this session with a plan. The plan was the 5 and dime plan, and part of that plan was a property tax relief. Now, early on, we had designed our property tax relief around Senate File 54, which was vetoed by the governor last year, which was 25%. When we saw the outcome of the certification of the ballot initiative for 2026 being 50%. We felt that was something that the people, said they wanted. So we started going for that type of tax relief. Now that changed a lot of things as far as how much we could manage to do backfill. And I would like to take a minute and explain backfill, because there's been much to do about the fact that the Senate and the governor do not want to backfill. And I think one of the things Tony wanted to have aired out was, well, why not? Why wouldn't you do backfill? And I can't answer that for those senators or the governor, but what I can answer is why we wanted to do backfill. And so if you can imagine this, we're state representatives working at the state level, and we determined that we were going to provide property tax relief on residential property tax. That is a local tax. Almost all that money goes to your city, your county, and your schools locally, your local school districts, as well as your hospital, any kind of special districts you might have. So that's a local tax, and we were determined to cut that local tax. So what we're doing is we're telling all those elected officials locally that we're going to reduce the amount of revenue that they have to spend. So a good conservative tenet is to reduce spending in order to reduce taxes. So there were many stories about what your Joint Appropriations Committee did with the governor's budget recommendation. The reality is we reduced that budget by $235 million. What did we do that for? We did that to repurpose that money to provide that tax relief. But it's a state budget. Again, the tax relief was a local tax. The tax cut was a local tax. And the spending reduction is at the state level. So how do you reconcile those two? You reconcile those two with backfill. So in other words, we're going to grant monies to those local governments that were cutting their revenue streams. Those are elected officials, elected to determine how those collected taxes will be spent. So those elected officials have a relationship with the people who elected them. That's where the accountability really should be as far as their budgeting process. So when the Senate or the governor says, we're not going to do backfill, they're basically saying that we're going to cut your revenue, but you have to figure out how to deal with that as far as your budgeting is concerned. And those local officials may or may not agree with our tax cut. And if they don't, then that's between them and their voters. But we feel it's important that we take that tax cut that we effectuated at the state level and get that back to the local level where we did the tax cut, so that those elected officials can more easily make the determination of how they're going to deal with those reduced revenues. And I'll just say this, that none of the backfills that we've done have been 100%. So those local governments are going to still have to tighten their belts. But all the hyperbole that we've seen, I think Tony could take you through a lot of the math that he's worked on. It's been a monumental amount of work to figure out exactly what a 50% tax cut is going to mean to the city of Lusk, or the city of Gillette, or the county of Teton. So, we've looked at that, and it's not nearly what the 50% reduction of your home taxes will be. So it really becomes something along the lines of 2 to 10%. That's what these entities will be cutting back. And if we do a 50% backfill, that means it's 1 to 5% that they're going to have to tighten their belts, 1 to 5%. And that's much more doable, even though we are the ones making them have to do it.
All right, Tony. So talk to me about what the actual impact of this 50% reduction would look like. You've done a lot, like John said, you've done a lot of the math. So just give me a sense of what that's going to look like.
So I probably have to put it in a specific box to answer that question at any point. But so for example, what happens is you take the property tax, and everybody says, 50% property tax is going to be a 50% cut to our county. So the 50% reduction, everybody's freaking out over the 50% number. The 50% number is what has everyone concerned. But if you really look at what we're doing, what are we reducing? We're taking 50% off of the residential property tax. Well, let's just take a county, for example. That's one small slice of county revenue. okay? So if you look at the average general fund of a county, it's got property tax. One small piece of that is property tax, is residential property tax. And then they've got sales tax revenue and 10 other revenue streams to their general fund. And what we found as we dove into that, just to give you some examples, so take Natrona County, for example, and I'll just use my county. When you stop and look at their revenue streams and you say, okay, and I'll go back to the way the bill was when it left the House. For us, it was 50% of the residential structure. So Natrona County, everybody says, 50% firemen are going to be gone and your EMS is going to be gone. Well, ultimately that 50% impacts roughly about 5.4% of the overall budget of the county, as an example. Now, these are estimates taken from the reports, but they're pretty accurate because we try to be very careful. Now, think about that. If we put an additional we give half of that in backfill, there's your 2.5% or 2.7%, let's say.
Well, I've always said, not to interrupt you, but I've made the comment several times on my show that there isn't a budget anywhere that couldn't absorb a 10% cut. I mean, it might feel a pinch here or there, but every budget could take a 10% cut, and we're nowhere close.
Nowhere close. In fact, when you dissect them, that's exactly right. Almost all of them were less than 10%, and most of them far, far south of 10%.
But back to John's question, when Tony came up with these numbers, and they worked really hard to crunch these numbers for every county, and it turned out to be much less of a backfill than we had anticipated. And so my question is, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you provide that backfill if it's less than what we thought, and we've already made room in the supplemental budget to do so? There's no reason not to do that, so that local governments aren't hurt, because they are reducing themselves to our county, for instance, I think was 5% last year and probably 15% this year of reduction that they're doing on their own.
Yeah, Campbell County's, it's kind of a one-off. I mean, from everything I've seen.
Right. So in this case, backfill to us was always very important. And the fact that it turned out to be a little bit less than what we had anticipated, all the better.
There are caveats. So, for instance, your hospital district, it's going to be much more impacted because it doesn't have sales tax and other types of taxes. It's all property tax, but it's not all residential property tax. So, for instance, you might have some industrial property tax and some commercial property tax and some ag property tax that gets collected by that special district. And so you have to calculate, well, what is the residential portion of all the property taxes that goes to that particular entity? And then cut that in half with further 50% reduction, and then cut that in half again because we do a 50% backfill. So it ends up being not nearly as bad, but those special districts would likely be impacted more than cities and more than counties would be. So there's an amendment from the Senate side brought by Crago that backfills a few of those special districts, mostly to do with EMS, fire, and hospital. And it is for 1 year. And then we, in our side of the budget, did a backfill for statewide all the special districts. And then we also did a backfill in the budget for the 8 what they call hardship counties, so those that are the least wealthy counties in the state. But it turns out that, for instance, I believe it was Niobrara, we always look at it as probably the most hardship county we have, but I think that they were below 3% of their property taxes come from residential.
Yeah, it's a really tiny amount with Niobrara County.
Yeah, so if you cut that 3% in half, you're at 1.5, and then if you get a backfill, it's 0.75% of 1%, 0.75 of 1% that they would have to reduce their budget by.
And I think it's important too to note that schools would not be affected at all, just in the way that they're funded by the state and in the Constitution. The schools would not see that reduction at all. they will always be funded.
That is right, and it's done on the backside. So they go ahead and spend what they've been authorized to spend, and if there's not enough money there, the state fills their checking account back up.
Well, and that narrative didn't last very long in the media. I did hear it once on the floor. I think it was probably yesterday. The attack on education. But the truth is, they won't see a dime less than they did last year. All right, guys. So let's talk about next steps. What happens next? We go back to the conference committee, or do you guys have a plan?
Well, if I can say, the most important thing is this: we're not trying to kill Senate File 69. We just want to find some good common ground that makes sense, and we want to work with the Senate to do that. So the most important thing I say out there, and I've put that out there in the media already and let people know, we are not trying to kill the bill. Us taking a little extra time to make sure we look at the impacts and how it's going to affect the House and where we can get the votes is all we're trying to do. Property tax relief is very high priority for us, and so we're going to continue to work for that.
Within the rules.
Within the rules, there you go.
All right, guys, thank you very much. I know you had a really long day, so I really appreciate it. And you're welcome back on the program anytime you want.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Talked a lot.
So there you have it. It's a very different story than the one the Wyoming Senate is telling, and it's also very different than the tale that some in the Wyoming media printed yesterday. The long and the short of it is, it doesn't sound to me like they had a deal to begin with. And second, the deal that was thrown at them by the members of the Senate Joint Conference Committee was against the rules anyway and definitely would have been objected to on the floor of the House, which is probably the motivation behind why the Senate handled things the way that they did. But in the end, we're all going to have to wait and see what happens later this week. My guess is, since their first plan was foiled, they'll have to come back to the table with another compromise. This one that both the Senate and the House have actually talked about. Well, that'll do it for today's installment of the program. Have a good rest of your week, and we'll talk again on Saturday during Weekend Update. Today's program was also brought to you by the Wyoming Cartridge Company. They're a Wyoming-based ammunition manufacturer that makes a quality product at a fair price, and they're headquartered right in Sheridan, Wyoming. Actually, their factory is right around the corner from the Cowboy State Politics studio. I've burned through several boxes of Wyoming Cartridge Company ammunition, and I can tell you for a fact that it holds a pattern just as tight as any other ammunition that you're going to get off the shelf. So if you're going to buy ammunition, you should buy it from a Wyoming company. That's the Wyoming Cartridge Company. Go to their website, wyocc.com. For now, from the depths of the Middle Swamp in Wyoming's capital of Cheyenne, I'm David Iverson, and this is the one and only Cowboy State Politics.